Welcome to another episode of Commending and Contending, a podcast about how the gospel of Jesus encourages us to live our lives and use our words to commend and contend for Jesus and his gospel. I'm your host, Jonathan Holt. Joining me today is Dan. G'day, Dan.
G'day, Jonathan.
Dan, where's God planted you?
That's such a beautiful metaphor. I'm planted in Murray Bateman, and in fact, from where I'm sitting right now, I'm looking out the window towards my 10 sheep. We're on a little bit of property. The organisation that I work for owns land and a campus out here, and I'm involved in the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, which is an organisation that effectively seeks to train Christians for leadership in politics and culture more broadly.
So are they your sheep or do they
Yeah,
belong to the whole organization?
they're my sheep, and
Fantastic.
about one of them a year gives up his life for us to have a great big lamb roast. Yeah.
Oh, yum. That sounds so good. But and how do you feel about that moment where the sheep gives up his life so that you can eat?
It was the first time we did it was actually last year, and it was quite solemn. It was the first time I'd ever done it, and a mate of mine came out with his rifle, and we dispatched the sheep. That was a little bit. Yeah, we were all kind of standing around, and it was a very kind of solemn moment. And then we had to butcher it, and none of us actually really knew how to do this. So there's a lot of YouTube videos and plastic sheets, and but we figured it out. But you do
Wow.
really have that sense of this. This is an animal who's giving up its life. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. There is something really solemn about the animal giving up its life for the sake of another to feed it. Yeah. Deeply significant. Lachlan Macquarie Institute, we probably don't know a lot about that. You gave us the kind of one liner. Just say a little bit more about how does the organization do the thing that it's aiming to do there?
Effectively, we're a leadership pipeline. And I think Christians increasingly need to think about how we train up our leaders. And as our society changes, that becomes more and more important. The way that we do it is through intensive residential training. We run 3.5 month residential programs on site here, where people come from around the country. We take about 8 students at a time, and we then fly in lecturers from all around the country and a little bit from overseas as well, who'll teach small modules, 2 weeks at a time. We start with laying a theological foundation, and that's my responsibility. I do that. It's a great privilege to spend time doing that with people. But we do some intellectual history and political philosophy, a lot of skills training as well, how to speak and debate. We even do things like etiquette training, how to host a fancy dinner. And then we place people into Parliament, in the federal Parliament, where they'll work in an office there for a period of time. There's a lot I could go into more detail. There's a lot more than we do than that as well. But I'm immensely proud of the program. I think it's really very, very good, and quite an innovative approach to how to help people, help Christians um, get get better at being Christians in the specific work that God has called them to.
Mm. Dan, how has God been encouraging you recently?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jonathan. And you prepped me that one, so I've been thinking about it this morning. And um, I think the work that God has been doing most in me over the last few months is trying to get me to pay attention to the goodness that He's put in each day. My mind tends to kind of constantly be running off to the plans and the things that I'm working on. And sometimes that means that I can be very full of myself, and other times really, really discouraged. And even just this morning, I was reflecting again on just the abundance of joy and goodness that God has put into each day, and that my fundamental stance towards the world is to be a witness to what God is doing, in the sense of just enjoying His goodness, as well as then going and saying and showing it to other people.
Wow, that's so lovely. Just it's it's that kind of general approach people have of take one day at a time, but with a really helpful overlay on it of God as provider and sustainer and giver of good to those who he loves.
I think that's right. I think my temptation, and it's probably true for lots of us, is that I see myself as the great actor of my life. The life I'm writing is a story about me, and God is slowly and constantly calling me back to realize that it's actually the story about Him, and that the part that I play is to be the witness, the spectator, and the one who brings back praise at what He's been doing. So I'm a long way away from being good at that, but every day I'm trying to learn a bit more.
I wanted to pick up on the particular work you do around training Christians to think about that space of political life, because we're all in one way or another political beings. We're post-election, federal elections over and done and dusted now, but we all, got the sausage and gave our vote and participated in the process. That's a pretty low level kind of political engagement. Some of us probably walked into vote not thinking about it at all until we got there and suddenly had to make a decision. Others may have done like lots of research and kind of delved into political policies and read biographies and tried to come and understand all the platforms and processes. When you go to vote, what's it like? When you head to the polling booth, given the work you do, what sort of things are going through your mind?
Yeah, it's a real combination. I know candidates, and that's interesting because knowing them as people breaks down a little bit of the party partisanship. So I kind of tend to lean a particular way politically, but I know quite well people who are on in the other party, and I like them a lot. And so even on Saturday night, seeing a few of those people who I like in the Liberal Party losing their seats, there was a real sense of, oh, that's a shame. That's a good person, and I'm sad that they're not going to be in the parliament anymore. So there's that dimension to it. Then there's also the sense that I want to practice what I'm teaching others. And so my temptation, like lots of other people, is just to kind of not think much about it. But I actually deliberately do what you just said. I look up the party platforms and read their policies, and I look up the biographies of the people in my electorate and in the Senate in New South Wales where I live. I do think that the single most important thing to think about in the voting process is the candidate that you're voting for. And so I spend a lot of time actually trying to get to know those candidates. I love local government elections actually because it's easy to actually meet them. And I love the conversations you can have at the polling place with the councillors before you go in to vote. And so I do that, but I also do other interesting things. This time, for the first time, I'm not sure how I think about this. I actually asked ChatGPT a bunch of questions as well, and kind of went through and said, "Hey, here's the range of kind of policies that I really care about. Here's the kind of electorate that I live in. What do you reckon would be a kind of preference selection to kind of maximize that?" So I kind of did some research that way. I'm not sure whether I think that's a good thing or not. It's something I tried out this time. Yeah.
Do you think ChatGPT and other AI services have political leanings like human beings do?
Not like human beings do, but they are, you're always at the mercy of how you ask the question. Um, so there are questions around how the training data is uploaded, and they won't do certain kinds of things for you. And there have been lots of examples in the past of them giving certain kinds of responses to questions, the sort of black Nazi kind of thing. But I think by and large, it's actually there's a skill in asking the question in the right way. Yeah.
So when we think about being Christian and being involved in the political part of life, I think some Christians kind of keep those areas really separate and they never mix. It's kind of like nothing good's happening in politics and my Christian life is completely separate. But then it sounds like the way that the Lachlan Macquarie Institute kind of prepares people and the way you think through things suggests that we should have more overlap. Is there a political view Christians should have?
Goodness, that's a big question. Um, one of the things that I actually find really helpful with people is to sort of to map out the rough kinds of stances that Christians tend to have, and you sort of gave us one of them, which is actually let's not have much to do with it at all. And that you can have sort of harder or softer versions of that. It might just be that you've got better things to do with your life, or
Yeah.
it might be that you're actually really committed to the idea that Christians are a separate kind of group of people, and that politics is not a space for us to get involved. That's sort of the more Amish or Bruderhof kind of stance. But we can all default to that at times when the political system feels pretty dark and you don't want to be a part of it. It's much nicer just to, get in with your Christian friends at church.
Mm.
Um, I definitely meet and work with people who are a bit like that. But then you have the sort of other camp, which is, um, you know, Abraham Kuyper, the kind of Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and an amazing Reformed theologian, is very famous for the sentence that he came up with, I think, addressing university students, where he said, "There's not one square inch of this world over which Jesus does not cry, mine." And so there are Christians who enter into the world and into the political space saying, hey, all of this belongs to Jesus. And if we think that the gospel has implications for all of life, then it's going to have implications for all of our political policies. And so we need to be in there, engaged and actually transforming the world to make it look more Christian. And you can have stronger or weaker versions of that as well. You can be a full-on, what you might call a theonomist or a reconstructionist, where you want everyone in your society to live under biblical law. You might just be someone who actually wants to see more justice in a particular kind of area that you're committed to, whether that's refugees or pro-life or something like that. So they're two big camps. There's a couple of other ones, and probably most of the people who are listening to this kind of podcast belong in what you might call a more two kingdoms kind of way of thinking about the world, where you've got one kingdom. Jesus rules over everything, but he rules in two different ways. You've got the rule of the gospel, where he's saving people through the proclamation into his church, and he's also ruling by a common grace over the whole world. And Christians kind of belong to both of those spheres. And I think that's a reasonably helpful way to think about the world. The problem that it creates for us often is like, how do you hold the two things together? And it often makes kind of schizophrenic Christians, where you're pretty well thought out about what it means to live in the redemptive kingdom and to be proclaiming the gospel, and you've got a kind of sense from civics at school about what's going on in politics, but you don't have a good sense of how they come together very much. And so I'm often interested in those kinds of problems as well.
Yeah, it's good to think through that moment where you step back and realize that you actually have an approach. You have a way you're thinking about, even if it's non-engagement, you actually have a structure around that that's kind of framing the way that you're operating. And it's good to kind of own that, I think. And one of the dangers, I wonder if you can speak to this a little bit. One of the dangers, I think, is sometimes a particular Christian or a Christian organization will talk as if their frame or approach to political life is the right Christian way to do it. And if I'm not on board with their approach, whether it's the kind of don't have anything to do with it or it's every square inch and so we ought to be in there changing the world, they talk as if I should be on board with them. Should I be on board with them?
Yeah, that's a really helpful comment, Jonathan. And one of the things that I've had to kind of learn to do is to recognize the different places that people are coming from, and to try, like you say, to help them recognize it for themselves. Because what I find are a lot of Christians who are pretty angry at other Christians because they think you're doing it wrong. And they're not really quite often very reflective about why they think that they might be doing it wrong. And so, yeah, so to kind of put names on things, something like the Australian Christian Lobby, which I do kind of work with, are very much in that transformationist camp. They're there. They have a theological rationale for thinking that the phrase in the Lord's Prayer, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," means active political engagement, and means changing laws in particular ways to represent what God's will in heaven looks like in our legislative system. Um, Now, I would say the two kingdoms kind of crowd. I think Sydney Anglicans and Sydney evangelicals and evangelicals broadly in Australia kind of often fit in that. We all, like you say, we also have a stance, and it's a theologically worked out stance, which makes us sometimes a little bit like worried about that kind of crowd over there. And we're kind of like, oh, what's going on with your eschatology? And what about that kind of space that Jesus kind of gives for people now to live even in rebellion against him while we wait for the final judgment. But what's helpful about recognizing that you're coming from different places there is that you can actually have a biblical argument about it, rather than just kind of going, oh, you're doing it wrong and I don't like you. A lot of politics is kind of gut level often. It's to actually kind of sit down and say, okay, why are you committed to that? And where in the Bible are you seeing that? And to recognize actually that there are real biblical principles at work in those different stances and camps. And to kind of draw those out, see what's the best in them, and then try and make a really good theological argument about which is the best way forward. Yeah.
Sounds like there's many ongoing conversations we could be having here. And yet at the same time, I find this is sometimes a tricky area because people's gut level commitment to their position means that there's a whole bunch of emotions tied up with it, not just a kind of casual conversation. Their sense of what would make a good world or how to live well in the world drives a lot of their thinking. And the other
Mm.
area that I think might be a little bit troubling for us as Australian Christians is the way we see, say, American Christians engage with their political system and possibly not really thoughtfully enough realize how different American Christianity is and how different the American political system is, that it doesn't just transfer over, and yet we're seeing it and we're aware of it. Do you think it's influencing us too much, the right amount, not enough?
There's a couple of really interesting thoughts there. The first thing you talked about, the sort of emotional level of thinking about politics, I think is really true and becoming more so. I think there are people who've written about this, and I think it's quite plausible that increasingly politics is becoming part of that kind of expressivist trend in our society, where we vote in a way that says something about us or what we would like to be true about us. And we're projecting that out into our kind of parties and our leaders. And it's much, much less about specific policies or, as I would say, the kind of heart of our system, which is about electing a person who you think could represent you and make wise judgments on your behalf. Now, that does supercharge a whole bunch of those other kinds of problems. And we are really wrestling with that in our secular society and in our churches as well. And we need to address that. The influence of American politics on Australia is deep and profound, and I would love to talk about this for hours, because it's a story that doesn't, in a sense, start now. Like the effect of America on Australian politics goes right back to the founding of Australia, as you would know from kind of if you've done Australian history, and that story is very interesting. Australia has kind of grown up in the shadow of a great empire, and that's affected our politics all the way through. It's affecting it increasingly now because our media ecosystem is changing, and so there are aspects of the Australian population, and particularly the Australian Christian population, that are very wired into the American media ecosystem. And during COVID, I think that became very, very evident to us in a way that it perhaps hadn't been. Um, some of this plays also into trends and real issues that we have in our churches. The reality is that in large rural areas of Australia, there isn't much gospel ministry, and people deeply rely on podcasts and YouTube and things like that to hear Bible teachers. And the algorithms that promote those things are going to send them to places in the US for better or worse, sometimes for better, sometimes for very worse. And that's where they're being discipled. And so one of the first things that we would want to do to address that is just to send more people to lead faithful churches around the country. Like it deeply grieves me actually that people are being pastored in that kind of way and taught in that kind of way. Um, the other thing that it does, as you recognized, is that it draws us into a bunch of political conversations that are very different from ours. Like you're saying, the American system, I have fairly formed views on the goods and the bads of it. It is quite different from ours though, and I don't think many Australians really appreciate that. In fact, occasionally at church, I'll run into, like when I'm visiting churches, I'll run into someone who just says like the American Constitution is the best one that's ever kind of been developed, and there is a view in America that it is a sort of divine document. Um, I think it has very deep flaws, and in some ways, the Australian Constitution and our political system had the benefit of seeing some of that and being drafted in the light of it. And so I'm very proud of the Australian Constitution. It has its weaknesses as well, but it is its own thing, and we are a very different kind of people in some ways, and we need to recognise that. Yeah.
So, for people listening now who are kind of thinking, well, Jonathan, Dan, this has been very interesting, but the election's over and it's going to be a few years before I have to think about that any of that again. What sort of things do you think the regular disciple of Jesus ought to be thinking or doing or praying about when it comes to politics and their life?
I have three kind of categories that I think about for Christian engagement with politics. The first one is just the ongoing task of proclamation that every Christian is involved in. This is going to have three P's because I used to be a pastor of a church and I still can't avoid it. And again, that's right at the heart of who we are as Gospel Coalition people, right? But the political implications of that are often underappreciated by us. A healthy society, and particularly democracies, are healthy in as much as they are able to know what is real about the world that they're living in and respond effectively to that. That's why in Canberra you'll hear lots about evidence-based policy. And we want evidence-based policy and reality corrected policy. And so to proclaim the gospel, to say Jesus Christ is Lord, is a really important political statement. Not just, I mean, it's political on the surface of it. It's saying something about a ruler, but it's also saying something about what is real. And as Christians tease out the implications of that statement as we go to growth groups and Bible studies together and listen to sermons, we're actually just kind of wiring ourselves into a reality. Um, what we should not be afraid to do though is actually kind of keep going through from the very clear kind of statement, Jesus Christ is Lord, to the kind of middle implication type statements, which the New Testament is full of. So therefore, do X. Even down to the level of, I then think this might be the best way forward for us. Like recognizing that that's a much lower level of certainty, that often we're a little bit afraid to go that next kind of level. But one of the things I see throughout Scripture and in the New Testament as well is that part of what it means to be a new creation in Christ is to be given the task of judging. And Paul actually says something quite strongly about this when he's addressing the Corinthian church. It's part of what it means to be human, to exercise that image of God rule over the world around us, which we now see in Jesus and fulfilled in him. But as members of his body, we're actually called to that task of kind of judging the situations around us and making a call on what is better or what is worse. And we do that all the time. And most of our work is doing that kind of thing each day, right? Whether you're someone who works with your hands, a sparky or a chippy, you're making a call about like what is going to fit into this particular kind of building site or thing project I'm working on, whether that's working in policy and government, whether it's in your family. We're all doing that work of judgment, and we need to do it based on knowing what is real. And so we need to say to each other, this is what is real, and this is what I think fits here. And we can practice that in our families, in our workplaces, and we just need to extend it out a little bit further to kind of talking about it in our politics as well. That's the proclamation thing. I think there's a goal, a role for us in participation. That's my kind of second one, actually working alongside each other, joining political parties, getting to know your candidates. God has entrusted us with this incredible privilege of having ministers of government that we appoint, and Romans talks about his appointing of that, and in our context, he gives us a say in that. I think Christians always have a say in that, even when they're living under despots, actually. They have a say in it because they can pray. They can actually pray to the real ruler of the world and say, could you remove this turkey and give us someone else? And so they always have a say, but he's given us a more direct say in Australia. And we should exercise that. And then the third one is the slightly more spicy one, which is Christians always have a role to play as partisans. Because we live in a society in which there are two powers. There is Jesus and his kingdom, and then there are the forces of Satan, which have been decisively defeated, but are still fighting this rearguard action. And occasionally they want to deny the authority that God has given his people to proclaim the gospel and to do good works in the world. And so we actually have to fight sometimes for the rights and prerogatives of the church in order to kind of be allowed to keep doing that. And that gets into the space of something that can be quite uncomfortable at times, but I think it's a real thing that we need to do.
Thanks for chatting with me today, Dan. It's been really helpful.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's a real privilege to be with you.